Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I rise today to urge the Senate to take action to crack down on child pornography offenders and to protect our children. This is a growing crisis, and it is one that is near to the heart of every parent in America. I can attest to that as a father of 3 small children myself. I've got a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 16-month-old baby at home. But I can also attest to it as a former prosecutor. As the Attorney General for the state of Missouri, one of the first things I did was to establish a statewide anti-human trafficking initiative and task force, because what I saw as Attorney General of my state was that human trafficking, including, unfortunately, child sex trafficking, is an exploding epidemic in my state and around our country. Children are exploited, children are trafficked, and those who work in this area, those who prosecute in this area, law enforcement, who work day in and day out, will tell you that the explosion of child pornography is helping to drive this exploding epidemic of child sexual exploitation and child sex trafficking. The problem is that child porn itself is exploding. A New York Times investigative report found that in 2018 there were 45 million images of children being sexually exploited available on the internet. 45 million. Just a few years before, it had been 3 million. In 2018, 45. Then last year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children found that number had grown to 85 million. 85 million images on the internet of children being brutally sexually exploited. And as every prosecutor and every law enforcement advocate and every law enforcement agent who works in this area will tell you, that explosion of this material, which, by the way, is harmful in and of itself, is exploitative in and of itself, is driving a crisis of child exploitation and child sex trafficking in this country. Now, the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court has helped bring this issue front and center. Her record of leniency to child sex offenders has been much the center of her hearings, and it has startled the public. A recent Rasmussen survey found that following her hearings, 56% of all respondents said that they were troubled by her record on child sex offenders. That included 64% of independents. And they're right to be troubled. Her record is indeed startling. In every case involving child pornography where she had discretion, she sentenced below the federal sentencing guidelines, below the prosecutor's recommendations, and below the national averages. We now know that the national average for possession of child pornography, the national sentence imposed on average, is 68 months. Judge Jackson's average, 29.3 months. The national average sentence for distribution of child pornography, 135 months. Judge Jackson's average, 71.9 months. In fact, it's true for criminal sentencing across the board. The national average of all criminal sentences imposed in the United States, 45 months. Judge Jackson's average, 29.9 months. This is a record of leniency, in the words of the Republican leader, leniency to the extreme to child sex offenders and on criminal matters in general. But, we are told, and have been told for weeks on end now, it's not really her fault. We were told by the White House and Senate Democrats that it's not her fault because those federal sentencing guidelines that she, in every case where she could, went below, those guidelines aren't binding. Thanks to a decision of the Supreme Court by Justice Breyer, Justice Stevens, those guidelines are only advisory. And so we were told repeatedly that if we really want to get tougher sentences for child porn offenders, then we're going to have to change the law. In fact, I see my friend Senator Durbin here today, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He said this to me multiple times during the committee. On March the 22nd, he said to me, "I hope we will all agree that we want to do everything in our power to lessen the incidence of pornography and exploitation of children. I want to tell you, Congress doesn't have clean hands. We haven't touched this now for 15, 16, or 17 years. Senator Durbin went on, "We've created a situation because of our inattention and unwillingness to tackle an extremely controversial area in Congress and left it to the judges. I think we have to accept some responsibility." And he went on, I don't know if you, meaning me, have sponsored a bill to change this. I'll be looking for it. If we're going to tackle it, we should. Well, I agree with that, 100%. I agree we should tackle it. This is the time to tackle it, and I'm here to do that today. I'm proud to sponsor and introduce legislation along with my fellow Senators Mike Lee and Tom Tillis and Rick Scott and Ted Cruz to get tough on child porn offenders. Now, let's be clear. When Congress wrote the child pornography federal sentencing guidelines, and it is Congress that wrote them substantially way back in 2003, when Congress wrote them, they wanted them to be binding. Congress meant for these guidelines to bind federal judges. The Supreme Court struck that part of the guidelines down. Now it's time to put it back into place. My bill would create a new mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years for every child porn offender who possesses pornography. 5 years. If you do this crime, you ought to go to jail. It would make the guidelines binding for any and all facts that are found by a jury or found by a judge in a trial. Restore the law to what Congress intended back in 2003. Take away discretion from judges to be soft on crime and get tough on child sex offenders. That's what this bill would do. Now, I've called this bill the PROTECT Act of 2022 because it's modeled on the PROTECT Act of 2003 when Congress wrote these guidelines. And I just note for the record that I believe every senator voted for it back in 2003, including the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Durbin, and every member of the Judiciary Committee, Republican and Democrat, who was serving at the time. That act back in 2003 toughened penalties for child porn offenders, made the guidelines mandatory, and explicitly took away discretion from judges to sentence below the guidelines. I think it was a pretty good law, and I think now is the time to act. Our children are at risk. The epidemic of sexual assault, sexual exploitation, and victimization is real. And let's be clear on what child pornography is. It is an industry that feeds on the exploitation of the most vulnerable members of our society, that feeds on the spectator sport of child abuse and child victimization. If you have a lot of images of child pornography, you ought to go to jail for a long time. If you possess child pornography, you ought to go to jail for at least 5 years. And yes, it is time to tell every judge in America to get tough on child porn. That's what this bill would do. And I just urge the Senate now to take this opportunity to act. And so, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of S. 3951 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.